I think a lot of Americans have a sense of fascination with Australia. And maybe it comes from an idea of this shared history, or maybe this kind of idea that Australia is so much like the United States, this culture, makeup, so forth. When we look at Australia, at least I do, uh, it's a lot like looking at a mirror image in some way. Of course, I say this with no understanding of Australia itself. I've never been to Australia. Many of us haven't. At least many of us not in the United States have been. So what we know about Australia is often fed to us via film, pop culture, maybe the zoos where we see kangaroos and koalas and other things, perhaps memes. And maybe it's a little bit different for Australians. I don't know how much American history they get down there, but it's a fascinating thing to me, this idea of Australia. You know, we almost moved down to Australia when I was a kid. When I was 4 or 5, we were living in Louisiana at the time, and my stepdad got an offer to go work on oil rigs down there, and we almost moved down there. And I often wonder about how my life would have turned out had I moved to Australia. And later in life, when I was struggling, I was single and couldn't really find anyone to date or anything like that, I thought, well, maybe my problem is just Americans. Maybe I just need to move to Australia. There, I'll be the American chap. I'll be the guy with the odd accent, and maybe there I'll find my hook and find someone to be with. Alas, poor York, that didn't happen either. So my dreams of going to Australia have, as of yet, been unrealized. But HATM has been to Australia, and through the work of our two guests today, we started a version of HATM AUS, or as you'll hear today, Hat Mouse. It's not my baby, it's theirs. Today's podcast is with two friends of mine, Joel Barnes and Chelsea Barnett, two people I didn't know before we got this whole thing going on, but they reached out to me one day and said, hey, we like what you're doing up there in the States. We'd like to kind of do our own take on it. Would you mind? And you know, I had really been so protective of HATM in its first year and a half, that I had turned down a few different folks who wanted to do their own versions of it. But something about Joel and Chelsea just struck me as these are people I like. I knew immediately that they were friends of mine, even though I'd never had a conversation with them before. And over the last few years, we've built up this friendship. They're two people that I absolutely adore and love following. I love seeing what's going on down in Australia. You guys have seen me tweet before about following Australian historians, follow Australian scientists. When you're up late at night at 2 a.m. and can't fall asleep, they're up banging away, sharing their thoughts, their worldviews, pictures from Australia. It's this really cool avenue for me. I don't know. My fascination goes deep. And a lot of that is due to this film we're talking about today, which is 1986's Crocodile Dundee. When we start talking about movies that are historical artifacts or have something to say, Crocodile Dundee is probably not the movie that comes to mind. Yet I think what you're going to hear in this conversation today is that this is an incredible timepiece. When we look at this movie, it shares so much about the United States, about Australia, about masculinity, femininity, race, colonialism. There is a ton. Environmental history. There is a ton of stuff in this movie. It is a goldmine of historical information, which I really didn't conceive upon until talking with Chelsea today. And I say talking to Chelsea today because tried as we might, we could not get Joel's internet to work properly. We tried to get him in here. You may hear early on where we're trying to get him on and going, but that's part of it. I was talking to our producer, Fletcher Powell. Do we just edit this out or so forth? I was like, no, Joel was here in spirit. I want him to be part of this podcast. We're going to get him on at some point in time. So you may hear a little confusion at first about us trying to get on, but understand that we'll consider that as cross-cultural differences or something along those lines, something smarter historians than I would be able to give to you. So I hope you're going to like today. Today, I think we go for almost 2 hours, and I think we could have gone for even much longer. This is a long talk today about an incredible movie. I think this is our first podcast that I actually think goes longer than the film itself. And I think that speaks to how much fun we had talking about this movie. So if you like Crocodile Dundee and you like HATM, and you kind of like meat, okay, you're going to dig this pod. So sit back and relax, because we're going down under next on Historians of the Movies podcast. And welcome to Historians of the Movies podcast. I am your host and creator of Historians of the Movies, Jason Herbert. I also like to consider myself a benevolent dictator in the midst of the latest colonial crises here in the United States, also episodes of Andor, just keeping it real with everybody. We are allegedly the longest running watch party on the internet. I don't know, but I'm making it up. And if I say allegedly, that's cool. So I'm here today actually with two friends of mine, and I am really geeked out to talk to you guys about this because I got two friends of mine who are from just around the block. We met virtually a few years ago and have been just like, with all the nonsense that Twitter is and social media is, just getting to know these two people has just been like one of the little joys I've had. So I want to introduce you to two of my friends, Joel Barnes and Chelsea Barnett. Joel is a historian of the humanities, science, religion, and universities. His present research examines the history of relations between evolutionary science and religious belief within Australian higher education as part of the Science and Religion Exploring the Spectrum project run by the International Research Network for the Study of Science and Belief in Society. Before joining the University of Queensland, Joel was a research associate in the Australian Centre for Public History at the University of Technology, Sydney. And his work there was on Australian Research Council-funded project on the history of humanities institution in Australia since 1945, for which he is finalizing a monograph on the humanities disciplines and the idea of national interest. You guys do way more stuff than I do. I do cows. We're talking about Florida. Person laughing at me right now thinking I'm a first-rate idiot is Chelsea Barnett. Dr. Chelsea Barnett is a gender and cultural historian whose work explores the representation of masculinities in Australian popular culture in order to understand the complex and varied ways in which masculinity has made sense in particular historical contexts. Under this broad research aim, she engages with feminist and queer theory, the history of sex and sexuality, 20th century Australian history, and the history in and of popular culture. She is the author of Real Men, Australian Masculinity at the Movies, 1949 to 1962, and has authored academic articles in leading journals including History Australia, Australia Historical Studies, and the Historical Journal of Film, Radio, and Television. She is currently the ECR co-representative for the Australian Historical Association, and like Joel, the co-convener of Historians at the Movies Australia. So there was this whole HATM backstory here that we're going to get into. Joel and Chelsea, welcome. Thank you so much for being here tonight or tomorrow. Y'all are ahead of me, right? What day is it over there?
It's Thursday. Yeah. So
Thursday there.
It is Thursday. So we are living in the future. It's nice.
Oh, this is good.
It's good. Nothing terrible has happened yet.
Well, just give it time. I mean, my Thursday hasn't even begun yet. So, we've got time.
Indeed.
I'm geeked. I'm so excited because we've actually never met in person. We've Zoomed before. Only the last time we did this, it was crazy late for me. I think it was like 1 a.m. or something like that when we talked about HATM for the Australian Centre for Public History, which was maybe a year and a half ago or something along those lines.
Gosh, yeah, it's been a long time.
Tell you what, before we get going here, I just gave the audience this huge spiel on what you guys do, and it makes no sense because I'm just reading off of some stuff. So maybe you guys can talk a little bit about the history that you do and how that affects film and your interest in film with the history that you do.
I might start because I think Joel is glitching in and out, so I'm hoping that his internet is okay.
Joel's actually part of the Matrix right now, which I believe was filmed in Australia. Was it filmed in Australia?
It was filmed in Sydney. Yeah.
There you go. Okay, perfect. Good. This works well.
Yeah, okay. So I am a historian of gender and sexuality, as you said, Jason, but I am also a historian of film. And so doing something like HATM or HATM, as the Australian version came to be known, was not only just a fun way, particularly for us in Australia, to get through lockdown, given the pandemic, but also kind of gave me an avenue to talk or give insight into some of the things that I work on or some of the ideas that I think through to, I suppose, a broader basis, or kind of broader audience. So yeah, my PhD thesis was on Australian masculinity, representations of masculinity in Australian films in the 1950s. And when I say that to people, particularly in Australia, a lot of people say, "Oh, I didn't know there were any Australian films from the 1950s."
A guy in Florida was just thinking that, so that's good.
Yeah, no, it was really common. Probably one of the most common responses I got to my research was, "Oh, right. And what actually are you looking at? Because there's nothing there." There was a whole bunch of really, really rich, interesting films being made in the 1950s in Australia. That's not to say, I mean, this is now getting into some of my work. It's not to say that it was the most fruitful time for filmmaking in Australia. It was a more difficult, I suppose, funding terrain, but really, really interesting national stories being told and being told through the kind of prism of gender. So, yeah, so just a beautiful way to think about how culture works to tell us things and tell us things about gender, tell us things about the nation, the world. And so then my postdoctoral project, which I'm coming to the end of, I should say, kind of was taking that a step further, again, looking at Australian pop culture, particularly films, but looking at how films represent ideas around marriage and sexuality and the idea of the single or unmarried man.
Oh man, this movie's gonna be perfect.
Yeah. Oh, totally, totally. And the idea that actually, in Australian films in particular, you can represent a man who is, technically married, but who enjoys a sense of singleness. In particular ways, so doesn't necessarily act as a married man, and the kind of cultural ground that operates on. So it's been really, really interesting. And I actually don't know if you've mentioned the film that we're going to talk about, so I might say it.
I haven't. Go for
I
it.
hope I'm not spoiling. Yeah.
Do it.
So we're our conversation today is going to be centered on Crocodile Dundee, the kind of the classic, enduring. I won't give my opinion right now. I'll just say the classic and enduring 1986 film where, the single kind of croc ruler heads over to New York. Really interesting ideas around gender and sexuality, both in that film, but also around the film, that actually play into the story that the film is telling as well. Anyway, so that's the work I do, and film has proven to be a really fruitful way of thinking about the questions that I am interested in as a historian. What does masculinity mean in a particular historical context? Why is it that, particularly in Australia, certain models or types of masculinity function with legitimacy? What does it mean to be a man or a real man?
I'm trying to figure that out for myself just right now, not in Australia, but like in Florida tonight. So as I drink my beer.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, one of the curses and joys, but curses of studying pop culture is that then every time you sit down and watch a film or a television show, you start thinking, "Oh, what are they doing?" So that kind of process of like, what am I doing? Drinking my beer and having a chat, and how does this, those questions kind of dominate my mind all the time.
One of the things is I kind of wonder about your own work is like, in the 1950s here in the U.S., we have all these fairy tales about the West that are super prevalent in American mainstream film. So is that being shared? Because, when we did the combo thing, we did Quickly Down Under, which is very much an American Western set in Australia.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, were those kinds of films being prevalent at that time as well in Australia?
In a different kind of way. So one of the things I think, both in America but in Australia as well, the prevailing assumption about the 1950s is it's housewives and men in grey flannel suits. And you get that image in American films much, much more than you do in Australian films, to the point where actually no films engage with that idea in the Australian 1950s, none at all. There are different ways of representing suburbia or suburban ideas, but actually most of the films are set in what we call the bush or the outback. There's one film from 1950 called The Kangaroo Kid, which was about an American guy who came to Australia. What was his name? Tex. He was a detective from San Francisco, and he came to solve a case. And that's very much in the, trying to emulate an American Western in an Australian style.
Well, the guy's name was Tex. I mean,
yeah, yes. I can't remember his last name. But otherwise, there is a very heavy focus on landscape and the land, and which is true of most Australian films, actually, but particularly in the 1950s. And so as much as American cinema in the 1950s is dealing with ideas of, is like Western, or dealing with ideas of the West, Australian cinema is there are some similarities, I guess, in that period as well.
You said a thing a moment ago that just blew my mind. Did I just hear you call it hat mouse?
Yes.
Is that what you call it? I had no idea. I called it HATM. I was like,
no,
hat mouse,
totally.
That's so much better.
Totally. This was not my invention. That was not I did not coin that term.
I love it.
And I can't remember if it was Joel or if it was actually, I think it was a big shout out to the director of the Australian Centre for Public History at UTS, which is where I currently work and where Joel used to work, Tamsin Peach. She's currently on maternity leave, but I'm pretty sure it was her who came up with Hat Mouse. And I thought it was a bit of a like, oh, haha, but we'll go back to like HATM Oz.
Right.
And then Joel, I'm sure it was Joel who kind of picked it up and just used it in our kind of casual conversations. And so then we talked about, at some point it was like, oh, I'm picturing a little mouse wearing a hat. So there was there was no actual mascot or anything designed, but if we had a mascot, that would have been it, I think. Hat mouse.
I think like at this point in time, like, so I'm actually in the middle of like having the HATM logo redesigned, and now I feel like we've got to like work a mouse into there as like some solidarity.
A shout out to your Australian friends. Yeah,
absolutely.
I think we'd appreciate that. Go for it.
So HATM, you guys had come to me about, like, I remember getting a message randomly, and I forget it was either from Joel or from yourself, just kind of randomly, like, hey, we like what you're doing. Would you mind if we did, and up until that point, I had been approached by a few other folks who wanted to do their own version of HATM. And I was always by the point, I was like, no, I don't trust you. Right. I need to protect it. Something doesn't go right or whatever. And mind you, like I always say, like, we have a very low bar here. I'm doing it. But I'm very protective of it because, it's our community. But I remember talking to you guys. I was like, yeah, I like them. Okay. And it was just really as simple as that. So I was kind of wondering, like, what led you, like, because you were wanting to do something. And then you guys, like, what was the backstory there before you guys reached out to me about Hat Mouse? I'm just going to say Hat Mouse. I love it.
Yeah, go for it. I'm glad it's catching on.
It's here.
And again, go.
Absolutely.
Just the global language, right?
I'm so happy.
So there had been conversations, and I don't necessarily know actually if Joel had been a part of these, but given my work in film, there were conversations that I had with Tamsin Peach, about possible ways of doing something more public facing about film. And that might have been something filmed on YouTube. Just, how might we have conversations, or how might we as historians have conversations about film where the public can watch or be part of, but are really engaging with experts. So there were a few ideas floated around, potentially kind of me and a few colleagues outside of UTS actually talking about television shows and movies or whatever, that never really kind of went anywhere. And then the pandemic hit. in March 2020. Fun time. And again, huge shout out to Tamsin, who is an incredibly sharp historian, but also a really sharp strategic thinker, and who said, we need to do something for the public, not only to build community in a time where our community branches, if I can use that word, have been completely shattered. We're no longer coming together for conversation, for the sharing of ideas, for the sharing of laughter, et cetera, et cetera. So we not only need to build community in some way, but we also need to occupy the space, because somebody else will do it if we don't. And we are the Centre for Public History. And so we talked about different things that we could offer. And one of the things was, oh, actually, let's mobilize Twitter and do something like a watch party. I was not a huge Twitter, how do I say this? I had a Twitter account and was using a Twitter account, but hadn't really used it in that way before. And so actually was not super familiar with HATM. And it was Joel who knew more about it than I did. And so it would have been Joel who reached out to you and said, hey,
right, yeah,
can we, so the fact that you were like, yeah, I like these guys, I'm totally putting that on him. He's a really nice guy, and that's totally indicative of just his really lovely nature.
He's a good man with bad internet.
Yeah, exactly. A good man with bad internet. And I got to say, just, you know what? I don't want to jinx my own internet, so I'm not going to say what I was about to say.
You should absolutely say it.
Yeah, look, Australian internet, we could go at any time, really. Yeah, so it was really a way of how do we reach out to people during lockdowns, and so that's where it started. We for the first few months, we were doing 3 weekly hour-long live streams on the ACPH Facebook page, and so the Wednesday and Friday sessions we'd devote to other conversations, but Mondays became, let's talk about the movie that we watched on Sunday night with experts. So Joel and I would lead the Twitter conversation on the Sunday night. We'd invite an expert in that area to help out on Twitter if they could. But then, and a lot of people were like, oh, I'm not great on Twitter. And we would say, no, like it's totally low key. Please don't, it's not, it's low pressure. Please don't go to any trouble. You don't have to prepare. I mean, prepare if you want, but also just comment on the film any thoughts that come to mind.
Right.
So there was a little bit of hesitancy around Twitter. But then we would grab them on the Monday and do and kind of build on the conversation that had started on the Sunday night, and I suppose engage in a little bit more of a scholarly sense. I mean, it was still very friendly and informal, but we'd give them the kind of chance to engage, or to talk through scholarship and all that kind of stuff if they wanted to. And again, no preparation, just building on their own knowledge. And I have to say, we had some absolutely, and I mean, just even beyond Australian film, we had some phenomenal conversations that Joel and I, whenever we kind of catch up, and I mean, Joel and I are like super close friends now, and it's been a really lovely thing for our kind of working relationship and also our just friendship. But every so often we'll kind of think about like all the movies that we watched. And, we had a session on Clueless where with one person whose name I can't remember at the moment, Leslie Speed from Federation University in Victoria, who had written a book on Clueless. And so we thought, it'll be the kind of, the chat will be about Emma from Jane Austen and the kind of the adaptation, et cetera, et cetera. And she just blew us away with like, actually, there are so many other literary references here that she's, Amy Heckerling, who directed Clueless and wrote Clueless, is also drawing on these tropes in this piece of literature. And, and it was just mind blowing. And just things like showing both how fun film can be, but also how, the kind of ground it lays for really fruitful discussions. So we just had a ball. It was so much fun. And actually, particularly in 2021 in Sydney, we had a bit of an extended lockdown that Joel, who was then living in Brisbane in Queensland, didn't have. And so, because it was very state-based, the kind of response to COVID in Australia. And so HATM particularly became important for me living in Sydney, not being able to leave the house. I live by myself. And so it was very much I need this to keep sane as much as anything else.
It was, I think people are kind of surprised when I explained it. And, as you're talking here about how much time it actually takes to coordinate HATM, HATM.
Totally.
It's not just pick a movie and press play. So for folks who aren't aware, HATM and HATM really kind of operate entirely separately. There's they're kindred spirits, certainly, right? And certainly an air of supportiveness. And I'm just tickled pink, right? That you guys are doing, what you've done. But, it's not just, for me, I constantly think about what have we shown? What's the representation? Have we had too many of this kind of film?
Absolutely.
What do we have? It's like I spend hours and hours thinking about what film we're going to show, what comes next.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
It's a lot. People would be surprised, I think, at how much effort it takes just to host a watch party. I'm surprised.
Yeah. I can only agree 1,000,000% that theoretically you think, certainly I think, particularly when the kind of Monday conversation stopped and it was, okay, we'll keep on going with our Sunday night sessions. We'll ask somebody to join us. But you know what, that process takes maybe 10 minutes. No, actually, it takes a really, really long time coordinating with people. As you say, choosing a film that, and I don't know, so what I'm trying to say is that, in the Australian context, Australia has a kind of national cinema, and it's not necessarily that there's a lot of funding for Australian film, although there is government funding, but that it's a kind of, I suppose, a shared, it's a mix of government and private funding, but that Australian cinema tells national stories.
Are we thinking about things like Ned Kelly or things like that? Or
yes, absolutely. Anything from Ned Kelly in the 1970s to Ned Kelly in 2003 with Heath Ledger, to Ned Kelly, or was it the true story of the Kelly gang in 2019? Ned Kelly is actually the most told Australian story on screen. He's the most filmed.
Even I'm aware of him, right? So, yeah.
Right, exactly. Little tidbit that people might know or might not know, but the first feature-length film ever was made in Australia, 1908, I think it is. And it's about the Kelly gang. This is the first, it's remarkable, the kind of longevity of that story. And there's a very, very particular nationalist story that comes with Ned Kelly. Even with something like True History of the Kelly Gang, which came out in 2019, does some interesting things with gender and gender expression because it's based on the Peter Carey novel of the same name that won the Booker Prize in the 1990s, but still kind of still is bound by a really particular idea of Australian nationhood. And so when you're dealing with, when you go back to Australian films, it's not just like, oh, what's a good film to watch? It is actually, what messages are we going to be dealing with? What story of Australia are we going to be engaging with? Because it can be very easy to fall into the trap of the kind of white settler colonial pioneer narrative upon, that is a mechanism of settler colonialism, and that works in a kind of cultural way to further entrench the settler colonialism and the kind of, for lack of a better word, because my mind's gone blank, discrimination of Indigenous people, right? And so we have to be careful and want to show the kind of amazing cinema that has been made by Indigenous people, for Indigenous people, about Indigenous people. And then you also have to be careful that those are productive and good stories being told about Indigenous people, rather than the token kind of, let's just throw some Indigenous people in, and then therefore it's progressive and quote unquote progressive. Anyway, I just had a bit of a ramble, but so that was a very long, oh my goodness, long and winding answer or agreement with your statement. It takes a long time. I mean, it's fun, but it was a lot of work, and I'm sure you seem to find the same.
Well, I want to talk about representations of both Australia and the United States in the 1980s. Like we've been hinting at, like, talking about Crocodile Dundee. It was such a big movie when it came out, and it comes out in 1986. I'm like
Mm-hmm.
9, probably 10 years old by the time I see it when it shows up, in the on Cinemax or HBO or whatever it is next year. And I'll tell you, it's my first exposure to Australia. Realistically, I'm 10 years old. It's
Mm-hmm.
probably the first time I'm really seeing anything about Australia on screen or anything like that. I
Mm-hmm.
think that was probably the case for a lot of Americans. I've seen it a bunch, and sitting back, and I'd always watch it as just this enjoyable, fun romp. And then starting to think about this as a historian, I'm like, oh my gosh, the stories that it's telling about gender norms and sexuality and the frontier and New
Mm.
York and the United States and drug culture and all these different things. This film has a lot to say about two different societies and the stories they tell about themselves, right? So I was kind of wondering if you might be able to talk a little bit about, your thoughts on, you said earlier that you were going to hold off your thoughts on Crocodile Dundee. Now's the time to let
Now's the
go.
time. So actually, I want to ask first of all, because when before we started recording, you said it's you've seen it 100,000 times, and I kind of internally went, oh gosh,
Yeah.
and I wonder first of all what you think about the film. I'm interested in what you as an American and you as a historian and you as somebody who has seen it 100,000 times. I'm a bit younger than you, and so this film came out before I was born. So I was watching it in a. I've the times I've seen it were in a completely different context to seeing it. The year after it was released. So I mean, I'll get to my opinions, but I do want to know what you think about the film before I launch in.
Okay, so usually this is where, like, being the host, I get to pawn off like any kind of critical thoughts on anything on my guests, but now I feel like I'm going to have to. Okay, so all right, so growing up, like, this was this fantastic story of, like, this macho guy carries a big knife, fights the bad guys, and he's got all the hallmarks. Of course, I don't recognize this when I'm 10. It's just, but
Yeah,
it's these
yeah,
stories that I'm being served about what masculinity is, right? And all these different things, and this cross-cultural masculinity. Of course, the United States and Australia have a lot of parallels. I think that in a lot of
yep.
ways, we were talking about kindred spirits earlier, but I think in a lot of ways, the United States and Australia may be closer than maybe any other countries, or at least in my own mind. I always like to joke that living here in Florida, we are America's Australia. We've got alligators and crocodiles, and everything here is trying to kill you, especially our government.
No comment.
I'll leave that for another day. Thank you. So for me, it's still a fun movie, right? Because I don't take the film seriously. And I had this discussion the other day about movies that we do take seriously versus movies that we don't take seriously, and the stories that they tell. So, for instance, no one really takes The National Treasure too seriously. And of course, that was a founding film of HATM.
Mm-hmm.
But people do take, like, Gone with the Wind seriously, and the stories that it tells. So there's a story there. But however, like, looking back on it as an artifact, in a lot of ways, to me, this guy of Mick Dundee is a character we've seen before in the United States. The guy who is, quote unquote, raised by the Indians, by the indigenous people, and has a spiritual knowledge of the landscape. And we see this, with his interaction with the water buffalo, I think it is.
Yep.
And of course, his relationships. He's the good pioneer who has the relationship with
Oh
the
yeah.
Aboriginal people and things like that. And of course, we see this, and I want to say, like, in other films, maybe Last of the Mohicans, we've seen, kind of the story of a white man raised by indigenous people, learns the language, learns the culture, and really that becomes his cultural identity. Now, no doubt that those things actually did happen, right? It's like that seems to be a very popular trope for people to
Yes.
investigate. This white guy becomes the way that you interrogate questions of Aboriginal history or questions of Australian natural history. Am I doing it right? Am I getting it right? I hope
Oh my
so.
god, you're like hitting all the points.
I am not
It's
a
so
film
good.
historian at all, right? But it's like these are the things that I see now. And then, of course, there's this very critique of the United States as this corrupted place because
Yeah.
because it's weird. He gets on a plane and goes to New York, and all of a sudden he's no longer the expert in the wild. In fact, he becomes the babe in the woods of New York City,
Mm.
right? And through
Mm.
him, we see the corruption of the city through the drugs and the sex, and all this kind of stuff. So it's an interesting story about like telling Australia as like this barbaric yet natural space that is somehow still better than the corrupted city of New York, right? Those are my initial takes on this. So tell me where I'm right, wrong, and otherwise, please.
I'm so proud of you. It's as for your quote unquote initial takes, you've done such a good job. So I don't love this film. And one of the reasons that I asked what you thought about it was because and I totally take on board you have a nostalgic attachment to it, etc. So
Very
I
much
didn't
so.
want to come in and be like, absolutely. And there are films that I watch and love, and now with the benefit of age and education and my own expertise in this kind of field, I watch and go, oh, it's not great, but like I loved it when I was 7, so I'll keep going. So I totally take that on board, and nostalgia is, I mean, a topic for a whole nother conversation, but a really powerful means through which an attachment makes sense, I suppose, if I can put it that way. But I didn't want to come in and, I suppose, shit all over the film, and then you're like, oh, by the way, it's my favorite. So I
No,
wanted
by
to know
all
what I
means,
was
shit
dealing
all
with.
over anything. It's okay to disagree. Like that's
Okay, here we
the
go.
thing. So by all means, take it apart if you want.
So there are a few things. So I mean, honestly, and absolutely genuinely, there's so many things that you just said. I was like, yep, 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 like ticking all the boxes. But there are a few other things I think we can delve into that stuff, and I want to delve into that stuff. But there are a few other things I want to mention first of all. So I'm going to ask: are you familiar at all with the phrase "throw another shrimp on the Barbie"?
Certainly.
Okay, so for listeners who may not know or who may not be familiar or may have forgotten, so throw another shrimp on the Barbie is a phrase that was uttered by Paul Hogan, who plays Mick Dundee, in an ad made by Tourism Australia in 1983-84. And this is an ad that's made, it's a tourism promotional ad for Australia itself, and it's made for the American market. So this is not selling Australia for Australians. This is selling Australia for Americans. And so it's a very, very specific idea of what Australia is. That Australia is this kind of wondrous nature, natural, barbaric, but also fun and sexy, etc. culture that's on the other side of the planet, and we're chilled out and fun, and we throw another shrimp on the Barbie. Actually, I think that's one of the like Mandela effect, where you think that he says something and he doesn't. I think that's an example of it, because I don't think that's the precise line. But anyway, so Paul Hogan is in the 1980s a television star. He starts. He's on a like a comedy sketch show. I think it's called the Paul Hogan Show, and so stars in that Tourism Australia ad, and becomes incredibly successful and recognizable, and gets the role of Mick Dundee because of the success in the ad, right? And I think that that's a really important lineage to point out, because the work of Crocodile Dundee is building on the work of the Tourism Australia stuff, right? It's selling a really, really specific understanding of what Australia is to an American audience. Now, it happens to go gangbusters and the whole world starts to watch it as well. But this is a film, it's made by Australians, but it's made for Americans.
Right.
And I think that goes a long way, that understanding of who the audience is imagined to be, goes a long way to explaining, from an Australian point of view, the kind of confusion that this film, or the confusing way this film represents Australia and represents Mick Dundee. Because on the one hand, there are a lot of well-worn Australian tropes, Australian national tropes that the film draws on. And I was watching it last night going, like I rewatched, watched it again to prepare for this. I was watching it going, yep, okay, they've done that, they've done that, they've done that. And then in some ways it kind of turns it on its head and doesn't actually work with the logic of those tropes, which I'll talk about. And so does some things that don't necessarily fit with how those tropes usually play out. And actually Joel's dropped out. His internet is that's Australian internet, folks. But he's had to drop out. But we chatted before actually our meeting up with you, Jason, and he said a really lovely phrase that I wrote it down. Joel said that the movie is an ad and it's incoherent because it's a fantasy. So there's it's a kind of fantastical vision of Australia and Australian men that's being put forward. I also just don't think it's a great film, but and I know one of the things that we might talk about is other films that do Australian stories and Australian histories really well, and I'll get to that. But I think that there are a lot. When I watch this, I think, oh, there's so many other better films. Why did this one have to go be super successful?
This one went gigantic in ways it's hard to explain. I think I wrote down earlier it was made for $8.8 million and made $328 million in 1986. That is ridiculous.
And unless I'm mistaken, I think it's still the most successful Australian film of all time. In terms of financial, returns.
Crocodile Dundee Part 2 did very well as well. Now, the third one did not, but, the first two made tons of money.
Were huge. So I suppose I kind of get into a little bit more detail with the things that the film's going on, what's going on in the film. So there are long-standing, again, tropes. Tropes is just a really useful word in this situation, so I apologize if I repeat it.
Trope it out.
Trope it out. Let's go. Trope. So there are a few long-standing ideas or tropes that this film kind of mobilizes to do a lot of kind of the shorthand of expressing some ideas. The first is that, as you said, Jason, the idea of the good pioneer. And that has a very particular history in the Australian context. But basically, that white guys came and discovered these places for the first time and did the work of understanding the landscape, if not necessarily taming it, because I think that this film in particular represents the Australian outback as an untamed space. Whereas in other films, you get the sense that there are very clear ideas that the landscape has been tamed or managed by Australian pioneers. So you get this idea of Dundee as this kind of all-knowing kind of ingenue, that is one with the landscape and who has received that knowledge or has built that knowledge and built that kind of understanding of the land and the nature and the flora and the fauna based on his relationships with Indigenous people. The thing that was so frustrating to me watching it, it seemed, and sorry, before I get into what was so frustrating. So when I was watching it, I was like, it has all the hallmarks of being like, hey, I'm not racist, right? Like I've black friends,
Right.
And at the beginning, Sue, the American reporter who's in Australia, says to Mick Dundee, what do you make of Indigenous people or the Aborigines' claim about, getting the land back? And he says, no, Indigenous people don't want to own the land. They belong to the land. And again, Joel and I were talking beforehand going, how convenient that Indigenous people don't think of land in terms of ownership. Because in the 1980s, land right claims or claims to land rights were really becoming more and more visible in the Australian political landscape. So in the 1990s, the Mabo case in Australia overturned what was the doctrine of terra nullius, which was when the British arrived and they declared that the land was terra nullius, it belonged to no one. So Mabo in the 1990s overturned that because there was a successful claim to native title. But obviously before Mabo happens, these conversations are unfolding about native title, about land rights. There are, in the 1980s, there are questions of treaties and all of this kind of stuff. So it's just really convenient that, first of all, the main leading character, who's a white guy, is like, no, they don't belong. Like they don't own land. What are you talking about? But also, I was so frustrated watching it, going like, Sue, talk to the Indigenous guy. Like he's right there.
Right.
But she waits till he leaves, and then he's like, so, like, Mick Dundee, what do the Indigenous people think? It's like, but you just had one. Like, just talk to him. And that's a really common kind of, particularly, I did my, as we were talking about before, I did my PhD on the 1950s. And that's a really common trope in the 1950s, this idea that, like, white people who are progressive and who get on well with Indigenous people have like they're friends, and they've learned their land management or learned their relationship with the land from the Indigenous people. But it's not to strengthen the Indigenous people's claim on the land. It's ultimately to strengthen white people's claim on the land and justify their idea of like belonging or ownership of the land, right? So even in that first kind of 10 minutes, I was just like, oh. And then we have, I'll just kind of jump forward a bit. We have the juxtaposition between the representation of Australia and of America. Now, there are cities in Australia, right? Like
I'm told.
Sydney.
There are cities, right?
Apparently.
Hamlets. At least there are villages, I'm told.
Look, considering the state of Joel's internet, like actually this is not giving a good advertisement for Australian.
To be fair, Joel threw his internet onto Barbie is what happened. So
yeah, that's right. But it's doing quite deliberate work in setting up the urban jungle of New York, as opposed to the natural jungle of the Australian outback.
And he would have had to have flown out of like Sydney or Melbourne or someplace, right, to get to New York, right? I mean, he would have had to have gone through a city to get to the city.
Exactly. It just doesn't make any sense, Jason. And another thing that so first of all, that distinction between the Australian bush as opposed to the Australian or to the city, that's another really well-worn narrative in Australian kind of cultural nationalism or Australian culture is what I'll say. The idea that the cities are like, and this is dating back to the 19th century, these ideas. The cities are dirty and immoral or amoral and full of sex and drugs and bad people and bad ideas and bad behavior. And not only that, but cities are faceless. Cities are generic. So if you're in a city, you could be anywhere in the world. But when you're in the Australian bush, you know that you're in Australia, right? As I said, these are really, really long. These are ideas that have a really long history in Australia. So it's not necessarily surprising to me, like that kind of the stark juxtaposition that unfolds in Croc Dundee. But then the other thing is like, but this is where there are moments where I'm like, but that doesn't make any sense. Like it doesn't fit the logic of the trope. Where he's kind of both a kind of worldly knowledgeable man, but also at the same time like a naive child. Like on the one hand, he opens up the menu at dinner and he's like, oh, it's Italian, right? Like he understands completely what the Italian language is, what that means. He knows what a television is. And I know it's the 1980s, but at the same time, he doesn't know what cocaine is. He's never apparently
scene, right, comes right to my head, right? With this, your sinuses or whatever it is, yeah.
And don't get me wrong, that method actually does work. If you need to clean up your sinuses, I can attest to that. But I was just watching it, going like, this is so lame. Like, come on. And also, and I'm not an expert in this, so this is just based on things I can only mention this in passing. Without giving any kind of historical expertise behind it. But the idea that Indigenous Australians had ways of altering their state, if I can put it like there are different kinds of quote unquote, to use a common modern term, there were drugs, ways of getting high, ways of altering your natural
Sure,
state,
absolutely.
et cetera, right? So the idea that Mick is like, oh, cocaine, like what? I don't understand. He's laughable, completely laughable. He's not. He's still living in the 1980s. Like he's not. He didn't time travel, So
It's the 1980s. Cocaine was everywhere.
yes, exactly.
I mean, that's one of the things they're saying about New York. It's like, and don't tell me you couldn't find cocaine in any major city in Australia.
Indeed. Oh my gosh. Precisely.
And that doesn't it kind of treat like all of Australia as this completely removed space? Like you can't get Colombian Bam Bam and
Exactly. This kind of backwater of
sure there was a
like
market.
precisely. And from what I hear, still a market. But it's really in some ways it's such a hodgepodge of fitting the narrative or hodgepodge of kind of ideas to fit the narrative that again, like this is a sales pitch. This is not a film, it's an advertisement. And again, I go back to what Joel said before we joined the Zoom, was that it's incoherent because it's a fantasy. It needs to fit the fantasy. So you can have Mick Dundee, like the water buffalo, and then the dogs as well, like this telepathic kind of what like that where is that coming from? And he's stabbing crocodiles through the head. Also, how did he get that knife through customs? Like,
okay, I was thinking about that today. Like,
I know this is way pre 9/11, but
I don't know, right? But that's actually one of the most famous scenes in the entire film when he's like, "That's not a knife, that's a knife."
And Australians say that. We also say the kind of Simpsons knockoff, which is, that's a knife. This is a knife. Oh no, that's a spoon. Oh, I can see you've played knifey spoony before. But like these are which is my point is that's still like that's a famous scene for Australians as well, right? So Australians, I think, on the whole, still have a lot of affection for this film. The ad that preceded it, the Tourism Australia throw another shrimp on the barbie ad, remains in our cultural kind of memory or our cultural kind of collective knowledge as a bit cringeworthy because it's an example of like we don't say shrimp, we say prawns. And so it's an example to a lot of Australians of like Americans get it so wrong, which is like, I mean, but you've gotten it wrong because they didn't use like they're using language for an American audience. So right. the ad is a kind of bit of cringeworthy, like, but the film, which is really an extension of the ideas that the ad is putting forward, remains, I think, beloved, which is really frustrating as a historian of Australian film. Just again going, there are so many better films out there, guys. There's so like open up, And I also want to point out that even, when you first approached us about having this conversation with you, and Joel and I chatted about Crocodile Dundee, and he was a bit like, oh, I don't know if Crocodile Dundee is the best. Do we have? Is it still relevant? And unfortunately, I said to him, you know what, Joel, I think it is because so Australia has a really kind of interesting history of bad tourism campaigns in terms of how do we sell ourselves to the rest of the world. The most famous example was a campaign in 2008 where the final woman on screen, who's since become quite famous actually, but who was then, an 18-year-old model, beautiful woman on the beach, said, so where the bloody hell are you? As a way to be like, because Australians use bloody quite colloquially, bloody hell, it's hot, whatever. So was really drawing on that idea of like using Australian slang. And it totally backfired because other places around the world don't use bloody in that way. It can be quite offensive or, whatever. It's seen as a curse word. And so it totally backfired. Just a little side note that campaign, this unsuccessful campaign, was orchestrated by the man who would go on to become Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison. He's no longer Prime Minister, but he was head of Tourism Australia before he got into politics. Anyway, so we have a history of bad or unsuccessful tourism campaigns. So I think it's in 2017 or 2018, pre-pandemic, they go back to Crocodile Dundee. Chris Hemsworth, there was an ad, I think, at the Super Bowl.
I remember this.
I'm sure it's one of the Hemsworths. I'm 99% it's Chris. Is part of this ad and he's the son of Dundee. So you might have seen the ad, and I
remember the ads, absolutely, yeah.
And so, I mean, the Super Bowl is shown here, but I've never seen a full game of American football in my life. So I didn't see the ads until I was doing work on these kinds of ideas for a paper that has recently come out, and I was like, what? They went back to Dundee? Like, are you kidding? Like, there's so many other better, surely there are better ways of selling Australia, right? But again, particularly for the American market, seems to be an enduring idea of what Australia is, and it's the way to successfully sell Australia. You also, from Paul Hogan onwards, you also have somebody like Steve Irwin who's come in, the late Steve Irwin, of course, but who came in as this kind of crocodile hunter, wild man, in touch with flora and fauna. Again, not an Indigenous person, right? But like somebody who claims to have this special relationship with nature.
I'm not even going to lie about how much I loved him. I cried when he died. I remember, oh my goodness, he just seemed like a good dude.
I think he seemed like an absolutely lovely man, right? And his kids seem like really nice people.
I followed his son on Instagram.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And they've also become beloved as well. But what's really interesting about Steve Irwin is that and it's to the point now where I think maybe I'm taking crazy pills. Like maybe but I have this very clear memory of before his death, people being embarrassed by Steve. It's what we in Australia call the cultural cringe. This idea of like this larger than life. Crikey. You did a really good crikey there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll slip into my mock Australian accent.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it. You did a really good job.
Thank you.
But I remember people being like almost like humiliated that this was the man who was representing Australia on the international stage, being like, we don't talk like that. I actually don't know anybody who says crikey unironically, right? And he's on late night television shows handling crocodiles, and like when I see crocodiles, it's when I've gone to the zoo or when I've gone to like a reptile park or something like that. There aren't just I live in Sydney. It's a city. It's an urban big space, traffic, congestion, all those kinds of things, all the lovely things of living in a big city. I don't see crocodiles around, and so again, feeding into this idea that Australia is just this kind of wild, untamed space that needs the power of a particular man. Then, of course, he dies and the narrative changes. And now if you speak of Steve Irwin, it's done in hushed, reverent, our beloved Steve.
He was our guy.
He was our guy. And I sit there going, I'm sure that we all hated Steve. Or not hated him, but we're embarrassed by him. There's a paper in there. I haven't written it yet, but there is a paper in there. But which is all to say, my point is that these ideas that about Australia that have endured seem to really follow in the legacy of what's the movie? Crocodile Dundee. And so 2017, 2018, Chris Hemsworth's in a Tourism Australia ad as the son of Dundee, and again dealing crikey and knives and outback and et cetera, et cetera.
I'm kind of surprised we haven't seen a remake.
Yeah.
I've got to imagine someone's approached him by now because he's got to be now Australia's most notable export as far as actor goes in the current age.
It's very, oh gosh, that's an interesting statement. It's really interesting. So Paul Hogan was married and I think had 5 or 6 kids. Still has 5 or 6 kids. But when he goes to make Croc Dundee, and my understanding is that he leaves his wife and family for the person, I don't know her name.
Linda Kozlowski. Yeah.
Thank you. Who stars with him in that, and that really changes the narrative because he's no longer the kind of lovable ochre, and I'm using ochre there with a knowledge that you might not know the like what that refers to. I did just write a paper on ochres. You're welcome to read it.
What is this word?
Ochre, OCKER, and I mean that's not necessarily. It's a very specifically Australian kind of idea. It's really hard to explain the particularities of it without the cultural shorthand of knowing what it's that kind of breadth. I mean, look, you would say that Steve Irwin is a kind of ochre, that kind of crikey,
Likeable guy.
Yeah, likable guy, absolutely. But has the kind of broad Australian accent and uses words like crikey. It's called it's what's called strine, that accent of like stone the flame and grows and anyway, I wrote a paper about ochres in the 1970s.
Hyper Australian kind of Australian?
Yes. Hyper Australian masculinity.
Right.
And pushed to the extreme in particular, for very particular reasons that have a lot to do with gender and sex and
drinks a lot of Fosters. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
No, right.
Yeah. And in the paper I've just written, and I think that this is important to mention, but I argue that it emerges in the 1970s as a way of pushing back against second wave feminism.
Really?
Second wave feminism is making a claim for nationhood, and really challenging the foundations upon which the Australian nation has culturally unfolded and culturally kind of been based. And feminists come along and say, hey, actually, there's no space in this nation for us. We need to rethink the way in which Australia functions. And what I argue in this paper is one of the critical work that ochres are doing. There are like a collection of ochre films made in the 1970s. I don't think they're super successful in the States. There's one that does quite well in the UK. That's Barry Mackenzie, The Adventures of Barry Mackenzie. And that is also, this is really kind of deep cut niche content. It's also the first appearance of Dame Edna Everage, which I don't know if you...
Not familiar with one.
Okay, I'll just leave that. That's fine. Google if you want, but there's a whole other conversation to be had there. I could talk to you for hours.
I'm down. We can do many episodes.
Let's do it.
There are a slew of Australian films that I'm dying to ask you about, right? One of the things that fascinates me, right, is that so the marketing of Australia here, even I'm having a hard time not like slipping it into like my mock Australian accent every time I say
Please
Australia.
do it. Australia.
I'm just ready. So, but here in the States, we have so much, and of course, Australia seems to be this hyper masculine place for Americans, right? Mm. Very much in terms of like I think in a lot of ways, Australia is marketed as the Old West in a lot of ways. Like you're talking about the untamed wilderness, blah blah blah, own history of Aboriginal people. It's implied here in the States that there was also some really terrible treatment of Indigenous peoples in Australia, although that history is not as well known. Mm-hmm. But even like in our average, so here in the States, we've got Outback Steakhouse, right? Which I believe was founded, I want to say in Kentucky, actually.
Yeah.
It's not a single thing to do with Australia, right? Get the bloomin' onion. And then even like say with the Subaru Outback, which was originally pushed by Hogan himself, right? Which was the way
Wow, I didn't know that.
Oh, in the States, I remember this. The Outback was presented. Of course, it's a station wagon, traditionally a feminine space.
Yeah.
And then Subaru hires Hogan, names it the Outback, and then hires Hogan to market this vehicle.
That is so
based on the masculine idea of Australia. They purposely call it the Outback, right? And have Hogan as its pitchman, right? So you're very much playing on this idea that the station wagon can also be rugged, i.e., purchased and driven by men. And even we talk about Fosters and obviously rugby, Australian rules football, things like that. So I tend to think that Australia is marketed as a masculine space. Certainly it's done so in these films, right? And then another film since then, right? I'm thinking most specifically Baz Luhrmann's Australia, where you have, again, Hugh Jackman and his rippling abs is a drover here to save, here again, right? This guy who's got the special relationships with the Indigenous people. who is here to fight off the colonial powers and also win Nicole Kidman.
Yes. Oh, Jason.
So, yeah.
Yeah, so it's just so fascinating. So there are a few things I want to say. The first thing is, just because like it's so rich for discussion.
And I want to talk about Animal Kingdom at some point in time because I love that movie.
I've only seen it once because I can't go back to it because I loved it so much that I don't ever want to like ruin that love of it. Oh my God, Ben Mendelsohn is a genius.
Joel Edgerton in any film,
yes.
I will watch it.
Oh my God, Animal Kingdom is fantastic.
My friend Kevin Cruz got me into Animal Kingdom. He was like, you got to watch it. I was like, God damn it, Kevin, I'm planning on it. Leave me alone.
Yeah, like leave me alone. I've got other stuff to do. It's a brilliant film. Totally recommend. If you haven't seen it, people who might be listening, please go and do so.
Go watch it. If you
go and watch it. Stop. Finish the podcast and then go watch it. It's your next job.
Right.
I was going to say stop the podcast. Don't stop the podcast. Finish the podcast.
Don't stop the podcast. We have 2 hours to go.
Yeah, exactly. We're only getting started.
We're going through all of Australian cinema tonight.
Oh gosh, I could do that for you if you wanted to. So and actually a former colleague of mine, Shirlene Robinson, wrote an article about Outback Steakhouse and the kind of selling of Australia to Americans. So if you're interested in that, I would look that up. But it's funny, like there are Outback Steakhouses here that we go to, I think, with the idea of like, I think it's very clear that Australians know that this is how Americans see us.
The tongue-in-cheek adventure.
Yes. Contemporary Australian cuisine is influenced by, Asia and there's a huge French scene in Sydney at the moment. A lot of beautiful Italian restaurants. Like we have a great food scene here in Australia, particularly.
Sure.
Look, I'm in the biggest city in the country, so it is particularly good in Sydney. But like really great restaurants, really great bar scene. So I think when you go to a chain restaurant like Outback Steakhouse, it's very clear that this is an American, like not just, this is how other people see us. This is how Americans see us. Like I've never had a quote unquote bloomin' onion anywhere. That's not a thing that is like, that's not a delicacy. That's not a common dish. And also, the well-worn response is that nobody drinks Fosters in Australia.
Right.
I mean, I don't drink beer, but like nobody who would drink that piss kind of, that's the kind of narrative around that. It's just really interesting that this is the narrative that works for America. We have really different relationships with different countries. Like with the UK, for instance, it's always haunted by the specter of colonization and the ongoing reality of colonization and the ongoing kind of difficulties that settler colonialism continues to produce like material realities for Indigenous people, Aboriginal deaths in custody, the legacy of the stolen generations. There are still Aboriginal children being removed from their families. In 1997, there was a report, a Royal Commission into the Stolen Generations, produced the Bringing Them Home report, and that practice continues. The Northern Territory intervention, which, I won't get into here, but so it's, just a lot of examples of the colonialism continuing to produce very difficult realities for Indigenous people that continues to haunt or shape the relationship that we have with the United Kingdom, as much as we kind of rib each other with in sports and things like that. We have, a particular relationship, and it's quite a tense one at the moment with China, trading partner, all of that kind of stuff.
Who doesn't?
Yeah, well, indeed, I'll just pull my collar. And in Australia, there's a real kind of, it's the kind of space race tension, that we're located in the Asia Pacific, but racially we think of ourselves as a white nation because of those ties to Britain. So that produces particular tensions. We have, a kind of big brother, little brother relationship with New Zealand, and et cetera, et cetera. So we have all these really different, or the relationships with different countries around the world are produced through different kind of ideas or narratives. So my point is that I think it's really interesting that it's the Crocodile Dundee masculine kind of outpost, bottom of the world, both kind of a haven because it's pure and untouched, but also is barbaric and dangerous, and has dangerous animals, etc., etc. Yeah, I find that really fascinating. That's the ongoing or the enduring image of Australia to Americans.
So I think we both in agreement that Crocodile Dundee provides a fictionalized, an idealized, fictionalized version of Australia for American audiences, right? So, as a scholar of Australia, can you give to us, like, because I'm assuming somewhere on here there's somebody listening going, "I like movies. Can you talk about books?" Or "I like movies. Can you?" That's horrible. I'm sorry to everyone in Australia listening. It was awful.
Can I just interject and say your Australian accent is better than any American one I could do. So no judgment.
Well, okay, that's fair enough. Listen, I hide my native Kentucky accent anyway, so most of my own accents are covering up my natural one. But I'm wondering if maybe you can, like, at least, okay, so see if we can't talk through at least a couple books about Australian history. Say, for people who are interested in, like, the history of Australia or anything like that, what are things that you could recommend that you really dig? And then obviously movies about Australia that you find to be capturing, like, this is really maybe a better version of, like, or a realistic or whatever, like just movies about Australia that you like maybe a smidge more than
for sure. I'll start with books. I'm going to give a shout out to what is, I think, for me as a gender historian, continues to be a really influential piece of work, and that is Creating a Nation, 1788 to 2007. This is an updated version, written originally in 1995, I think, 1994, by four of Australia's leading women's feminist gender historians. We have Patricia Grimshaw, Marilyn Lake, Anne McGrath, and Marion Courtley. And this was really the first attempt in Australia, or an Australian scholarship, to write a national history through the lens of gender, rather than telling the well-worn story of, there was, now we would say, like, thousands of years of Aboriginal ownership or whatever word you want to use there, and then 18th century, the moment of contact, up until Federation, 1901, and then kind of 20th and now 21st century history. And so instead of telling that story, these four historians wrote basically, a feminist kind of history of Australia, which included a history, I suppose, of some, like, to some extent, a history of feminism, but using gender as the lens through which to tell a national story. This is an updated version and it's still now 15 years old. So there are some stuff that's been, like, there's more work being done in certain ways or in certain things, but it's just a beautiful piece of scholarship. So yeah, I would really recommend Creating a Nation. I'm also going to give a shout out to a friend of mine who's just written this book based on his PhD, or just published this book based on his PhD, Jared Hoare, that's Hore. So this is Visions of Nature, How Landscape Photography Shaped Settler Colonialism. And Jared looks not only at, I think this might be, it might just even interesting for your work, might not necessarily, anyway, it might just add some flavour, because I do love your work on cows.
Oh, thank you,
Jason. I thought your work on cows is so interesting. And actually, if I can give just a little tangent, there was a book written by a woman, Deb Verhoeven, who did it was her PhD that she then published as a monograph. I can't remember what it's called, but it's basically on sheep in Australian cinema and how the kind of presence of sheep in Australian cinema tells a national story. It's really interesting. Yeah.
They call it bad movies now. So sorry. I can help it.
No, I love, because it's so quick and I'm not that witty, right? Even with the bad jokes. I think it's great. Anyway, back to Jared's book. He looks at California and maybe Aotearoa, New Zealand, as well as the Australian landscape, but talking about how ideas around what a colony might look like and how it might function produced through nature photography. I'm in no way doing a good service to his beautiful, brilliant work. But again, I think in terms of how do we think differently and more intelligently, perhaps, and with more license to the brutality and the ongoing legacy of colonialism, particularly in Australia. How do we give credence to that? So Jared's book is a really, really lovely one. And then finally, what I will point to is a book on pop culture by a colleague of mine, Michelle Arrow. She's since written a book called The 70s, which is a book about the Australian 1970s, but through a prism of gender and sexuality. So how do you tell a national story, not through the kind of most well-worn, tired kind of frameworks, but how do you put gender and sexuality to the fore? So that's a really good book. But the one that I also want to shout out to is her book, Friday on Our Minds, A History of Australian Popular Culture since 1945, and telling the history of Australian pop culture, and through that we kind of get a sense of national history as well. As a scholar of pop culture, that has been a really influential book for me, and shows she's very good at showing the kind of nuances of that kind of cultural landscape and Australia's the conflicting ideas that Australia has to deal with, both in terms of relationships with the UK, with the US, with Asia. Yeah, so Friday on Our Minds by Michelle Arrow is another one that I would give a shout out to.
Well, what about your films? What do you like?
Oh, I'm so excited to talk about this. Okay, I won't go. I don't want to. I'm happy to talk for as long as you want, but I also don't want to take up too much of your time. So I'll try not to wax on.
Okay.
So the first one I want to give a shout out to is an Australian classic, and it's 1990. I wrote it down. Where is it? 1997. And whenever it's on TV, everybody watches it. It's just it just endures. It's a beautiful film called The Castle. And how do I give a quick summary? It's a film based on ideas around home and belonging. This is made as well in the post-Mabo landscape. So I talked earlier about Mabo being the case that overturned Terra Nullius. And so then that changes the way that it produces a change around how we as Australians need to think about belonging, land, home, etc. Australian cinema is obsessed with land. Australian cinema is all about land. The Castle does this in a really interesting way because it's about suburbia. It's about, again, just for lack of knowing how to put it a better way, how we understand land and belonging in the suburban context. Basically, there's an airport the airport is going to be extended, the runway is going to be extended, and so houses are going to be knocked down, and so the local residents kind of put up a fight, and it essentially makes its way through the court system, going from local to state to high court. But I'm so not doing a good job of selling it. It's much better than I'm currently articulating. Really, really recommend it. And I think it's available to rent on maybe Amazon or Apple TV. So really, really recommend it. It's also classic Australian humour. Not all of it has there are a few bits that you think, it hasn't aged, 100% hasn't aged super well. But I think on the whole, given it's now, almost 30 years old, I think it does a really good job. Incredibly funny, really, really beautifully told. And he kind of laughs with the working class, not at them. So the humour is done totally lovingly. It's a really, really wonderful piece of cinema. So I'll give a shout out to The Castle. 1994, which is 3 years before The Castle comes out, there's a really, really big year for Australian cinema. That's the year of The Sum of Us with Russell Crowe. It's the year of Adventures of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. But there are two other films that also come out that year, Muriel's Wedding and Strictly Ballroom. Give a really kind of interesting insight into, again, ideas around the city versus not the city, ideas around suburbia, and also particularly Muriel's Wedding, not telling a masculine story about Australia. Actually, what does it look like to be a woman in 1990s Australia? Muriel's Wedding is deceptively sad. I'll just say that. The first time I watched it, because it's so beloved and it's, ABBA and fun and dancing, I was like, oh, this will be a hoot. And it's not. It's really sad. But Toni Collette is just beautiful in it. So give a shout out to 1994 and the collection of films that came out that year, but particularly Muriel's Wedding. There are 2 or 3 more, if I can mention.
Go for it.
I want to give a shout out to some really beautiful films being made about Indigenous people. First is Samson and Delilah from 2009 that follows 2 Indigenous teenagers who kind of escape from the government, like a government-controlled kind of for a mission area, whatever, make their way to Darwin or Alice Springs. Is it Alice Springs? Yeah, Alice Springs. And it's very, it's not dialogue heavy. It's very quiet, but does a lot of work to show the difficulties and the realities of I suppose being an Indigenous person, being an Indigenous teenager in the late 2000s. That I think I did look this up too. That's on Criterion Channel.
Yeah.
Okay. Another thing that's on the Criterion Channel is a movie by Rolf de Heer called 10 Canoes. That's made entirely in an Indigenous language. So it's a movie with subtitles. Rolf de Heer is a great director who's made a lot of films about Indigenous Australians, and he's somebody who's very open to the nuances and the complexities and intricacies of Indigenous communities, indigeneity in Australia. So 10 Canoes is fantastic. The final film that, oh my gosh, I love it so much. And unfortunately, I don't know where it's streaming in the States. So if you can get your hands on it, please do, but just keep a lookout for it. It's less than an hour long, and it's called Terra Nullius, based, of course, on the doctrine of Terra Nullius that was announced when the British arrived in 1788. But Terra, instead of Terra, the Latin spelling, it's Terra, Terror. So
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Play on words. It is one of the most brilliant things I've ever seen. It's a film that is absolutely explicitly dealing with the ideas around Australian nationalism, and not only Australian nationalism, those ideas, but how they have been articulated in predominantly film, but film and television from 1970 kind of onwards. The film is made up almost entirely of sampled scenes, so it takes things from other movies, and it's dealing with taking, for instance, footage from like Grease with Olivia Newton-John as Sandy, and what's his name, Mel Gibson as Max. Can never say Rockatansky.
Yeah,
thank you. In Mad Max, and layering these kinds of cut up scenes and footage on top of each other, and to really ask questions about what is Australian nationalism, what role does Australian cinema play in I suppose articulating or furthering ideas around Australian. Like every time that a film is set in the bush, that says something immediately about what kind of story this is going to be telling. Or if it's set in the outback, like there are really, opening scenes, bush, outback, already you're engaging with, okay, like, so I'm getting a sense of X, Y, and Z. Like there are the cultural shorthand or the communicative work that those that settings do in Australian cinema. Because again, Australian cinema is obsessed with land. It's all about land. And so Terra Nullius takes those and flips them completely on their head. It's brilliant. Again, I think it's 57 minutes, so it's not long. I cannot recommend it highly enough. I hope that it's available to be streamed or accessed in some way in the States, but it'd be one I would put it on I'd put it on the list. If you can't access it straight away, keep a lookout for it, because it's one of the most brilliant things I've seen, and it's kind of knocked my socks off when I first watched it, because I watched it to write a review of it for History Australia, the journal, I think. I think it was that journal, or Australian Historical Studies, one of the two. And just kind of sat there with my mouth hanging open at the end of it. It's brilliant. Oh my gosh, I can't talk about it enough. It's really good. And I think that's why it's so frustrating that Crocodile Dundee is still beloved, even just nationally, because I think they're better films, guys. And not super obscure ones either. Like, I know Terra Nullius is more obscure, but like Muriel's Wedding is quite popular. The Castle, right? The Castle is a really popular film. Let's make that our kind of let's hold that up. But anyway, there's some interesting work being done in Australia. I mean, there always is. So it's an interesting scene upon which, or a landscape to kind of keep an eye on.
Well, let me ask you this. Here's our final question then. We'll bring this all the way back.
God, I didn't even need Joel. Gosh, I've just gone on and on.
Find Joel for something else, you know?
I'll tell him that.
There are other movies in Australia we can talk about. We can do a whole Heath Ledger-esque episode.
Jason, just tell me when and where. Honestly, like,
oh, absolutely.
I would. Yeah, I'll do this. I will chat with you.
Do Australians claim Russell Crowe? Because I think he was born in New Zealand, right, and then grew up.
He is born in New Zealand. We claim him when he wins Oscars, and we pawn him back off on New Zealand when he threw phones at hotel staff.
Is this a similar relationship to Mel Gibson?
Mel Gibson is an interesting one. I actually don't. I'm actually not 100% sure of what the public feelings are around Mel Gibson, because obviously he's absolutely deserved fall from grace.
Absolutely.
Based on his anti-Semitic ramblings.
Hateful stuff.
Absolutely, like despicable. Very interesting that, like, I wonder if that had taken place, if he had done that maybe, I don't know, 5 to 10 years later, I wonder if he would be given a chance at redemption, the chance at redemption that he has had. You know, he's been cast in films since doing that, but I don't think he's been cast. I'm trying to think of any kind of more recent Australian films that he's done, and I don't think, nothing's coming to mind. So I'm not 100% sure what the kind of finger of the pulse in terms of Mel Gibson. I mean, the other thing with Russell Crowe is that he is part owner, at least, of a sports team in Sydney.
Sure.
And so there's he's kind of embedded himself in the landscape, the cultural landscape that way, like, you know, attaching himself to he's a fan, but like attaching himself through a very famous football team based in Sydney, one that has a really long history. And so it's you know, that says something about Russell Crowe as well, right? Mel Gibson doesn't have that same hasn't attached himself in the same way. And so, I'm actually more unsure about how we as a people think about Mel Gibson.
Gibson, I think, is born in the States, and then his family relocates to Australia, right?
Yes, I think that's right. I watched Lethal Weapon for the first time in a long time, not that long ago, and the accent...
It slips.
Slips. There you go. That's a nice way to put it.
He slips into an Australian accent. You can hear it come out every so often. And of course, the maddening thing with Gibson and, you know, any number of other hyper talented, I don't think anyone's going to question Gibson's talent as a filmmaker, actor, and filmmaker. And then you have to qualify this with the way that we see him as a human being, which is, you know, just done some absolutely abysmal things, and you just go, oh God. Of all the people to say these things, we lost this amazing talent. And you know, I wrestle these things with when I show a film, you know, that might have a person, you know, so like when we showed Chinatown and Roman Polanski's director, right? How do you separate the actor from, or how do you separate the artist from the art? I
mean,
I don't have an easy answer for it, you know?
No, and I don't either. One of the films I would have loved to have done for HATM, which we didn't do because I just didn't want to open up these. I didn't know how. I don't know how to address it. I would have loved to do Midnight in Paris, Woody Allen.
Yeah, I was going to show that on HATM, and I had the worst. It was one of the only times I've ever actually canceled a film because the backlash was so bad. I like that film. I like it a lot.
I think it's a brilliant
so much
film.
Fun.
and for historians, right? Like if we're, you know, a
Talking about the
community of
lost
historians,
generation, absolutely.
yeah, right. Let's talk about these ideas of, again, nostalgia, romanticizing
Memory,
the past,
absolutely.
absolutely. Like these are crucial questions for us.
Corey Stoll as Hemingway. I could give me a movie.
Yes,
Give me a movie with him and F. Scott and Tom Hiddleston as F. Scott Fitzgerald
yes,
bumming around
yes.
France for a
I
for
will
you know.
watch that.
I'm
That's
down.
the thing.
I want that movie.
It's
No, you're absolutely right. Right.
exactly. You know, there are films that I would love to watch again without. I mean, again, you know, like Kevin Spacey.
LA Confidential was one that I had to like.
And you know, there are some that, like, you know, like I still watch Harry Potter and I still read Harry Potter.
What?
And yes, but right, but with and then there are some films that I can't do that. Well, like I can't. I don't know if I can watch Midnight in Paris again, or again Kevin Spacey films again. But with something like Harry Potter. I mean, the other thing with the Australian context and Mel Gibson is that Mel Gibson, one of his first big roles. Oh, actually, no, this comes after Mad Max. Sorry. So 1981, he stars in Peter Weir's Gallipoli, which is, I cannot overstate the importance of that film in terms of the cultural work that it does in reinstating Anzac Day, April 25th, as a day of national importance. We could speak for another hour of that. But we quote unquote celebrate Anzac Day as a kind of day of memoriam. In terms of World War One, it's the date of the failed Gallipoli campaign. But crucial, I mean, a fundamental, central, one of the most important ways in which Australians see themselves is through the spectre of World War One and Gallipoli. But that really kicks up again because of that film in 1981. It had lost relevancy, like it had kind of reduced in relevance, it had reduced in popularity, as in the day itself. And Peter Weir's film come along in conjunction with a few other things, and it turns it on its head and becomes, you know, quote unquote, the most important day on the calendar for Australians again. I mean, and historians love to point this out every Anzac Day, going, guys, there's a history to this. It's not just a given. But, you know, so Mel Gibson, like, you know, he's in that, and like he's so beautiful in that film. And I mean, like, physically beautiful. Like, he's a good looking man that does, and I mean, I might just be perving, but also like that does a lot of stuff too. You know, the fact that he's this kind of romantic hero in that film, that's important. And but then you have his most, you know, more recent, again, horrible behavior, and it's almost as though like maybe his time in America perhaps like corrupted him, or his time in Hollywood corrupted him. I feel like there's a separation between the way that we as Australians see Mel Gibson, you know, in terms of the Mel Gibson of Gallipoli and Mad Max, and the Mel Gibson of the last kind of 10 to 20 years. That's an unpolished thought. So there's more thinking to do there. But yeah, he's not as it's not as cut and dry with Mel Gibson as it is with somebody like Russell Crowe.
Yeah, it's not right, and it's just the thing I continue. I kind of come back to, like, say with the film, like say L.A. Confidential with say Spacey, was that, and this was the justification made in my head. And when I showed it, and I just kind of gave the disclaimer, like, hey, look, I know this guy's in this film. If you don't want to watch it, totally get it, right? But for me, if I don't watch this film because of this thing this guy did, right, then it gives that guy horrible actions power over all the other contributions of all the other actors,
Totally.
the staffs, things like that. And
Mm,
I'm like, do I allow that to get in the way of this other thing, or my simple enjoyment of the film, right? And I'm not, and I also have to be a historian, and I also understand that, look, terrible people can make some beautiful things. I know it sounds awful, and it's not maybe not the answer we want to hear, but I also think it's absolutely true.
mm.
So how do I? So again, separating the art from the artist, I don't have a good answer. I know that
I
humans are
don't
complex.
either. Humans are complex. Humans are complex. Humans are complicated. And I mean, even something like, and I'm sure that we have to wrap up soon, so I won't go on for too long. But even something like, you know, thinking about Picasso really changed for me and a lot of people when I watched Hannah Gadsby's stand-up show Nanette. and then I go into museums and Picasso is still being shown or whatever, and I think, like, what's my responsibility here?
Yeah.
This is a guy who apparently did some pretty awful stuff to young women.
Yeah.
How am I supposed to, what is my relationship to this art? Because I can totally appreciate his talent, and he's not making any more art. I think that's another thing, is that, like, it's not as though, like, Mel Gibson has made more films. Kevin Spacey, I mean, hasn't yet, I don't think, but I'm sure would like to at some point, even if he never does. But there is still the prospect of more work from Kevin Spacey, even if it never actually eventuates. But Picasso, that's it, And so, like, how do we, I don't know, like, I wonder if there's, anyway, it's complicated. But again, it's something that when I reread Harry Potter, I think, it's a really good book. Like, this is so much part of my childhood, and I'm totally able to separate my fierce disagreement with J.K. Rowling's views with my enjoyment of the work. So, maybe that's because of nostalgia too. Maybe my ability to do that, or my willingness to do that, is shaped by my nostalgia for growing up on Harry Potter, et cetera, et cetera.
It's an ongoing discussion, and it's, I've had this.
It really is.
A lot of folks throughout time, as long as I've been doing HATM, no one has a definitive thing on there, a definitive thought, and I don't know that there is one, so much as, like, you do what you kind of take from what makes you comfortable and kind of go within your own. And I go, okay, if you want to watch or you like the art or whatever, I think maybe there's an argument that says, life is very hard. You take beauty where you can find it. So if it's a beautiful story in Harry Potter or a beautiful painting or whatever, and you gotta go, this is what it is. So speaking of beautiful things, we'll bring this to a close. Let's talk about the great nation of Australia. It's not just a place, it's a people. So that wasn't really an Australian accent. It was kind of going someplace like Australia, also Irish Australian, something like the people, a little bit. Anyway,
I'm not even going to attempt, because I'm so bad.
It's fine. I'm not huge in
Australia. No,
yet.
I can say that I can totally I feel the love coming. So I know that it's done with love and affection, and
I very much want to get to Australia
and laughing with, not at.
Okay, fair enough. Well, let me ask you the magic question tonight, right? Which is Crocodile Dundee. Is this a history movie?
Yes. Yes, because it is not a period film. It's not set in the past. But, and I mean, look, maybe I say this because I'm a historian of film, and so any film for me is history, because I use it as a way to, right.
I always say that. Yeah.
But to get a sense of, if we take Crocodile Dundee out of the equation, and maybe even the tourism out as well, what other sources are there to explain or encapsulate the way in which that Australian-American relationship in the 1980s, right? What else? And I'm sure that there are things. Like, I'm not saying that there would be absolutely nothing, but the power of those two texts is so grand. It's so, like, they do such incredible, powerful cultural work, that to say that they are not historic, well, particularly, the film, to say it's not historical, again, it's not. I'm not saying that it's a historical film in that it's a period drama. It's not. But in terms of our ability to read culture, to read the way in which audiences were imagined in the past. I mean, this is the work that I do, right? So I look at historical films that are, period films, but I also look at films that are set that were made and set in a contemporary context. And they're like, the richness of film as a historical source is such that, like, to say no is to deny so much, that I absolutely have to say yes. It is history. It's built on historical narratives. It contributes to particular historical narratives. And it's a really, really interesting capture of a very specific relationship in the 1980s. And that is its enduring worth. Even if I don't love the film, it continues to give a lot to think about. So, yes.
Well, there you go. There is Dr. Chelsea Barnett's ringing endorsement of Crocodile Dundee as a historical artifact.
Absolutely. Oh my God.
All right. Well, look.
I feel like I was just going to jump into another like half hour, like, yes, but no, you've got to have dinner, like let's
I am
bring
not
it to an
throwing
end.
shrimp on the Barbie. I'm actually having leftover steak, but that's fine.
Oh.
Just wait till we get to Baz Luhrmann's Australia, or we'll have to come back and do Animal Kingdom. Or,
as I said earlier, Jason, just let me know. I will have this conversation with you again and again.
Well, we'll see if Joel will actually have this conversation with us at some point in time.
Hopefully.
And thank you so much for joining in today. Thank you so much to our producer, Fletcher Powell, who makes this show run. If you want to learn more about Historians at the Movies, Historians at the Movies podcast, you can follow me on Twitter at Herbert History. You can look for the hashtag HATM. Thank you all so much for listening. If you like the show, share it with some friends, subscribe to it, and we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.